Dear colleagues, thank you very much for accepting the invitation, for participating. Some of our colleagues will join us in the process. It's for me, honestly, a great day in the sense that so many great people in one place I have long not encountered, old contacts. I remember the good old days when we were interacting and discussing. Welcome to the Voice of Armenia conference. Let us open it officially. This event, dear colleagues, takes place today for two reasons. May 3 is International Press Freedom Day, and I congratulate all employees of mass media, journalists, editors, technical staff, the readers. On our professional day, I wish you resilience and patience. And tomorrow in Yerevan, the inaugural Armenia-EU summit kicks off, which is another opportunity to speak in the presence of high-ranking European delegations and our European partners about the state of democracy in Armenia, civil liberties, and all the values that lie at the heart of the European civilizational and political system. My wish to journalists is resilience and patience, and it's not by accident. Although there have always been problems in the field of freedom of speech and freedom of expression and freedom of press in Armenia, no government anywhere, no one likes the media and journalists, but especially in the last 8 years, the media in Armenia, a large number of individual journalists have been subjected to consistent and systematic attacks organized by the authorities, ranging from trumped-up criminal cases and physical threats to social media attacks, as well as moral and psychological terror, from limitations on personal freedom and freedom of speech to lawsuits against the media and journalists with consequences of heavy financial obligations, from hate speech generated by the ruling power and its satellite mushroom websites and social media pages to public insults and targeted cursing and insults, from discriminatory treatment to threats directed at the family members of journalists and even their underage children, from the use of violence on live broadcasts to other manifestations of obstruction of work of journalists, violent arrests, searches, property seizures, control and direction of advertisers. It is obvious that they have received indulgence from their unbridled behavior on becoming of a head of state and in general a high-ranking official and member of parliament. They've received this from their political leadership, whose actions are rarely met with any resistance from the relevant international organizations. The testament of this is that Armenia saw a significant deterioration in the World Press Freedom Ranking, falling from 34th place to 50th. According to the 2026 report of Reporters Without Borders, Armenia's media landscape remains extremely polarized, and journalists become targets of hate speech and political pressure. This indicator, however, is not just a number representing Armenia's position in the ranking. Behind it are dozens of acts of reprisals against media and journalists, criminal cases and trials, threats of violence against our colleagues. In 2025 alone, 37 lawsuits were filed against more than 17 media outlets. In addition to the denial of information considered insulting or defamatory, huge monetary claims were filed against media outlets. In these cases, more than 66,700,000 drums in compensation are being sought from 17 media outlets, excluding court expenses. There are numerous cases of violence against journalists by officials personally or through their bodyguards. Many more partners have been illegally banned from covering the work of state institutions, with their accreditations being terminated by arbitrary decisions of public officials. The authorities' campaign against the press has a systematic and consistent nature. These cases are separate manifestations of the policy against the media on a state level. The reasons for this consistent campaign against freedom of speech in the press are, of course, political. The current government, which is becoming more authoritarian with each passing day, is actually deprived of any viable mechanisms of checks and balances and feels threatened only by the press. It is thanks to the often arduous work of journalists that society learns about the government's excesses, permissiveness, and illegalities. In conditions of almost zero role of other systems of checks and balances, the press has remained the only institution fighting against the illegal and anti-democratic nature of the government. That is why the current government, consisting of a large number of former journalists, has declared the media a class enemy and is fighting against the press and journalists with the dirtiest of methods. Dear colleagues, the summit that started today in Yerevan and a number of statements that have already been made make it even more obvious that the undisguised manifestations of hypocrisy and double standards with which the European Union and individual countries treat the issues of democracy, including freedom of speech in Armenia, for the sake of their geopolitical interests, supporting what is obviously an authoritarian incumbent. All those values and beliefs that were once the basis of the European political system have today turned into simple, cheap tools for solving geopolitical problems. Our task, of course, is not to make a complaint to the European delegations. They are guided not by democratic values but by geopolitical interests, which implies support for the incumbents in the upcoming elections as well. It may seem strange at first sight, but today here, as we speak about the shameful state of democracy and freedoms in Armenia, we are indirectly defending the European values, and we're defending them against the hypocrisy of the Euro bureaucracy. And the goal of our work is to protect democracy, true democracy, which cannot exist without free speech and the media. Armenia's Union of Journalists expresses particular gratitude to its international partners, the European Federation of Journalists and the International Federation of Journalists. They have always appropriately responded to our calls. They've repeatedly spoken out against illegal actions and political persecution by the authorities against Armenian media outlets and journalists and broadcasters. In some cases, they've issued very strong level A warnings to the Armenian authorities, appealing to the Council of Europe's platform for the safety of journalists, which has also repeatedly issued level A warnings. Today, however, we will talk not only about the repressions and restrictions applied against the press, but also about the broader state of civil liberties. I am glad that in addition to representatives of partner media outlets, our conference is also attended by highly regarded human rights defenders and lawyers who I am sure will best present the real state of human rights and freedoms in Armenia in their reports today. I wish us fruitful work, and it's my pleasure to now introduce the speakers of our conference. Sianus Sahakyan, President of the Center for International Comparative Law, Human Rights Defender, representative of Armenian prisoners of war in the European Court of Human Rights. John Abner, speaking via video message, President of Christian Solidarity International, a human rights organization, human rights defender. Mr. Robert Amsterdam, lawyer and international human rights defender Aram Abrahamyan, editor-in-chief of Arabot Daily newspaper, Vartan Povesyan, political scientist, constitutional expert, Aram Orbelian, managing partner of Constant Dialogue law firm, international law specialist and lawyer, Yeram Stepanyan, human rights defender of Artsakh, Robin Melikian, human rights defender and lawyer, Narek Alistian, political scientist, candidate of historical sciences, founder of news website 24news.am, Rovanes Kudoyan, lawyer, human rights defender, Karen Bertanesyan, propaganda researcher and expert. Our conference is hereby opened, and for the first speech, and I would like to ask my colleagues to play the video message of the President of Christian Solidarity International, Mr. John Amer. This is his speech.
Hello, I'm John Eibner, the President of Christian Solidarity International. I'm honored to be among the distinguished contributors to this important Voices of Armenia conference. I must begin by thanking the Union of Journalists of Armenia and its talented and courageous president, Satik Seyranyan, for the invitation. I would also like to express my great regret in not being able to be with you in person. The Union of Journalists and each of its non-governmental members play a crucial role in preserving pluralistic society at a time when Armenia's democratic institutions are eroding, and as the state slides ever more deeply into the autocratic behavioral patterns that characterize its historical hostile neighbors, Turkey and Azerbaijan. Heading an independent, interconfessional, non-governmental organization dedicated to the promotion of religious freedom, I have naturally followed most closely the Armenian Prime Minister's orchestration of the persecution of the Armenian Apostolic Church, a sacred, nation-forming, nation-saving institution that has served as the principal bulwark of the Armenian nation through the many centuries of Armenian statelessness. But the abuse of power extends far beyond the persecution of the church. Other human rights defenders will, no doubt, address more than adequately other aspects of the government's departure from the rule of law and disrespect for fundamental human rights. I will state at the onset of this presentation that the Armenian Prime Minister, Nikol Pashinyan, is responsible for an illegal effort to overthrow the legitimate head of the global Armenian Apostolic Church, the Catholicos of all Armenians, Karakin II, and to place it under state control through a new Catholicos sanctioned by the Prime Minister himself. Since there is no consensus within the church for Pashinyan's attempted ecclesiastical coup, and of course much opposition to it, the Prime Minister has been obliged to achieve his goal by using the coercive means of the state. Short of murder, his methods are reminiscent of those used by the Bolsheviks to gain control over the church in the 1920s. The Prime Minister has subjected the Catholicos to a public smear campaign, claiming he is not the legitimate head of the church. He makes this claim on the grounds of the fabricated charge that his election by the church's National Ecclesiastical Assembly in 1999 was somehow illegal. Pashinyan compounds this allegation of religious illegitimacy with the claim that the Catholicos is a Russian asset who reports daily to an intelligence officer in Russia and who heads a mysterious war party inside Armenia. As such, Pashinyan claims the Catholicos is a threat to Armenia's national security. To add insult to injury, Pashinyan accuses the Catholicos of sexual immorality. The detailed research of Robert Amsterdam and his team of lawyers has effectively discredited this far-fetched version of America's Russiagate conspiracy. Pashinyan's attempted ecclesiastical coup does not rest exclusively on rhetoric. The Catholicos has been indicted on the charge of obstructing justice for refusing a court order to reinstate a dismissed priest. The indictment prevents the Catholicos of all Armenians from traveling abroad to fulfill global responsibilities. As his title indicates, Karakin II is the Catholicos of all Armenians, wherever they are in the world. The Church has more than twice as many adherents outside Armenia as inside the Republic. Over 20 bishops and priests have been similarly indicted and have had their freedom restricted. What the state is doing to the Church in Armenia is commonly called in the United States lawfare, that is to say, the abuse of the law to intimidate opponents. Some bishops loyal to the Catholicos have been imprisoned or placed under house arrest. The trumped-up charges have ranged from terrorism, as was in the case of the charismatic Archbishop Bakrak Alstanyan, or in the case of Archbishop Ashok Kachartrian, to planting marijuana joints in the backpack of an anti-Karakin protester over 8 years ago. The Center for Political Rights in Armenia has done an outstanding job documenting the illegal methods used in this anti-church lawfare. The persecution of the Church has extended to the laity in the shape of the Church's wealthiest and greatest living benefactor, Samvel Karapetyan. He too was arrested and incarcerated for having publicly indicated he would challenge the Prime Minister's persecution of the Church. Moreover, his businesses have been nationalized. So strong is the support for Karapetyan in Armenian society that he has emerged as one of the strongest challengers to Pashinyan in next month's national elections, already substantially marred by interference of foreign powers, most openly by the European Union. Pashinyan has also sought to undermine the Catholicos by forming a committee of 10 co-opted bishops. The Prime Minister heads this uncanonical body, the purpose of which is ecclesiastical subversion. This tactic mirrors that used by the Bolsheviks in the 1920s to undermine the authority of the legitimate leadership of the Church and its Catholicos, and they did so under the banner of a state-sponsored free church reform movement. The question must be asked, why is the Armenian Apostolic Church subjected to such persecution today? The definitive answer can only be delivered after a thorough search of archives that will not be accessible for decades, if ever. But it is certain that the answer is not to be found in the law, but in politics, and it is to be found outside, not inside, the borders of the Republic of Armenia. The fact is, Armenia continues to stand under the threat of renewed Turkish-Azerbaijani military aggression and other forms of state-sponsored violence and non-violent hybrid warfare. The century-old process of denying the Armenian Christian nation political agency continues unabated. This was the joint Islamist Ottoman, neo-Ottoman, or not Ottoman, pan-Turkic goal that drove the violent ethno-religious cleansing of Armenian Christians from Anatolia, Nakhichevan, Somgid, Baku, and finally, only 3 years ago, Nagorno-Karabakh. Pashinyan acknowledges this, claiming that an attack could come as early as September of this year. Political agency in the prevailing political cultures of Turkey and Azerbaijan continues to reside exclusively with Turkic and Muslim peoples. Having been defeated by Azerbaijan supported by Turkey and Turkish-backed jihadists from Syria, Pashinyan is desperate to avoid another war with a Turkic Muslim power that reveals its intentions by openly calling the Republic of Armenia Western Azerbaijan and pledging that the territory of today's Republic of Armenia will one day be reclaimed from its so-called Armenian occupiers. Among the Turkish-Azerbaijani conditions for a peace treaty is the removal of the Catholicos and the placement of the church under state control, as is the norm in both Turkey and Azerbaijan, and for that matter, in most authoritarian states. Catholicos Karakan II offends Ankara and Baku by publicly defending the rights of the ethno-religiously cleansed population of Nagorno-Karabakh, including the Armenian hostages that continue to be incarcerated in Baku. He also offends by encouraging commemoration of the Armenian genocide. These are taboo in Turkey and Azerbaijan, both genocide-denying states. Pashinyan is prepared to meet these and all other conditions Turkey and Azerbaijan impose as the price of a capitulation treaty. His policy is one of appeasement, not peace through strength. Pashinyan is furthermore pressed to do so by the European Union and the United States. The primary interest of Washington and Brussels in Armenia is geopolitical. It is to remove Armenia from Russia's sphere of influence. Their solution is for Armenia to integrate into that of the Turkish-Azerbaijani condominium. We can see that much of the same process was applied to Syria, once a safe haven for Armenian Christians, victims of the genocide. As President Trump himself has confirmed with satisfaction, Syria has been restored to Turkey following the overthrow of the Assad dictatorship by Turkish and Western-backed jihadists, headed by the now president of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara. The geopolitical Western political goal, in the case of Syria, was also to deny space to Russia and Iranian adversaries. It is helpful to keep in mind the thinking of President Trump's property development friend and now special envoy, Tom Barak. Barak has described the states that emerged from the collapse of the Ottoman Empire as no more than tribes with flags and imposed borders, political entities that were never meant to be nation states. That, of course, includes the Republic of Armenia. Promotion of this big geopolitical shift was the primary purpose of the U.S. Vice President's visit to Armenia and Azerbaijan last February, and now the presence in Yerevan of the leadership of the European Union and the European political community. The silence of Washington and Brussels about the persecution of the Armenian Apostolic Church and the other aspects of Armenia's democratic backsliding speaks volumes about their tacit backing for the Turkish-Azerbaijani condominium's strategic goal of incorporating Armenia into its emerging neo-Ottoman pan-Turkic bloc. Religious freedom and other fundamental human rights in Armenia today are being trumped by the geopolitical considerations of Ankara, Baku, Brussels, and Washington. The implications will be felt most acutely by the Armenians for whom the Republic of Armenia has been a safe haven. But they will also be, in time, painfully felt in Europe as the Turkish-Azerbaijani condominium continues to flex its growing muscle in the face of a Western world that has become increasingly dependent on it. Thank you very much for your attention, and I wish you all an impactful conference.
Չկա զվուկ, չկա ձայնը, ձայնը չկա, ձայնը չկա, չկա ձայն. Dear colleagues, I apologize for failing to introduce Armenia Ohanyan, Chief Editor of and founder of Rapper, daily publicist. I'm glad that recently she's speaking publicly more. I would like to give the floor, and I want to point out that we have 10 minutes per speech. But we do have an issue. Ruben Melikian has personal reasons for which he has to travel out of the city. So I'm going to first give him the floor and speak about political persecutions in the context of free speech. Advocate, lawyer, human rights defender Ruben Melikian.
So I'm not the only one to take the stage, so please continue. Thank you for the invitation, and using this opportunity I would like to congratulate the heroic representatives of media. I see many of you here, and I'm happy that we have such high professionals in media that help us to learn about the realities and also inform through you, our public, about the realities. So I have chosen a topic that could be discussed not hours but days, because the material is enormous. In order to fit into 10 minutes, I have to simply outline some important issues. Starting not from 2018, but 2019 probably. Step by step, drop by drop, in our country, fully fledged, well-coordinated, organized events have taken place. It actually included two main directions. One was the legislative one, when unequivocally they were adopting laws because they were not deliberated in the parliament, because in the previous and incumbent parliament, one political force had majority and they were able to adopt any laws, including constitutional ones. And if at the initial stages some deliberations have held and the opposition had an opportunity to amend somewhat the legislation in 2019-2020, afterwards there were no such formalities respected. I would like to underline this because the main topic is about democracy, and democracy is about hearing the voices of minorities, specifically political minorities. I remember only one law that has been deliberated quite extensively. You can actually hear that to see the differences between 2020 and 2021. It was about including an article on justification of violence in the criminal code. There was very interesting discussion about this draft law. Afterwards, many amendments have been introduced in the criminal code, in the civil code, related to limitations of the freedom of expression and speech, which was done step by step, in small steps, I would say. And similar laws have been adopted also in some European countries. But the second part, the second direction, is about enforcement of those laws. How do you implement them? We had a law until July 2022. It was about criminalization of insult. It was obvious that the law was applied discriminatorily, and the European partners, some openly, others in a concealed way, were actually advocating that this article should be taken out, or this law should be actually revoked. So there have been hundreds of criminal cases for insults. 90%, more than 90%, were related to Nikol Pashinyan, and 95% related to the ruling party, civil contract. So 90% Nikol Pashinyan, 5% other prominent members of the civil contract party. And I should say that we need to be grateful to the European institutions which carried out their partnership commitments. And since July 2022, this law was revoked. But I would like to inform our distinguished colleagues that this seemingly positive change had negative consequences because the authorities never ceased to punish their opponents who were criticizing them or using harsh words, and this led also to imprisonments. There is one point in that article which was hooliganism. It was a surprise to learn that the corpus delicti of hooliganism, we remember that, by the way, from the student years, that it should be associated with hooligan, who was a British citizen and who had specific behavior. And then I learned that hooliganism is not a Western phenomenon, but it was coming from the Soviet legacy. It was first introduced in 1922 into the legislation, and surprising part is that this is a phenomenon of the Bolshevism. A corpus delicti that was born in the Soviet times is now being used by our incumbent authorities to suppress the freedom of speech of their opponents. Just one example to use how it is being exercised. It is related to March 2024 and November 2025, and in the similar circumstances, it was used against people who were making political statements against the podcasters. Purely political program they run. Ms. Serena knows well that because she was dealing actively with this issue, raising voice. Eminem podcast, 2 hosts who are being prosecuted. It shows the behavior and attitude of the ruling party. I'm not talking about the lawyers or legal professionals, and how this behavior has changed and how the silence of the European structures and this word hypocrisy is here. Because of hypocrisy, we are now facing more serious consequences. In 2024, people were arrested for 2 and detained for 2 months with charges on hooliganism because they have used rude words in their podcasts or uncensored language, curses. So it is taken to the courts to detain them. The court grants that. They're kept in the prison for 2 months, then they're under home arrest. So there are some restrictions that they cannot actually run their program. And then we have, in 2024, a justifying sentence by the court. So court ruled that they're not guilty. So a rhetorical question. A person has a justification judgment, which is not enforced yet, by the way. Can we consider that this corpus delicti is not criminal? So hooliganism was actually related to online publications, not a real hooliganism, in real life, as we say. But nevertheless, in case of much softer language, when at the beginning of their program they have made a disclaimer that there could be some non-normative language used, and the podcast also presumes that there could be some rude statements. In November 2025, they were again arrested while using soft language. So now it was done by the National Security Service wearing masks. Second, they entered their homes early in the morning. They carried out a search. Then they have seized the entire property of our editorial stuff. It was about 2025, including the microphones, by the way. And then guys were imprisoned again. They were detained. And only a couple of days ago, they have returned all the assets. So until the end of April 2026, starting from November 2005, it was disposed by the investigative committee. And they were detained for a longer period. And now they're forbidden to take any public speech, in writing or verbally. So it shows how hooliganism could be abused, and because of hypocrisy, we see the aggravating situation. But it is not talked about and discussed. This is a vivid example. So, hooliganism as a crime includes a wide spectrum of application, starting with an ordinary citizen who is rashly criticizing a member of the parliament on the bus, or an 18-year-old young boy who is praying in the church and whose prayers have been interrupted by the Prime Minister coming in the middle of the service in the church with his bodyguards, and other issue. And I have to discuss it because we are holding an important pan-European event in Armenia. We are moving to Armenia, and our Prime Minister is wearing a map which was drawn by Stalin, and we are using an article or a corpus delicti that was designed by the Soviet Union and is still being used against the opponents to silence them. So because I have 10 minutes and I have exhausted them, I wish all of us fruitful work today. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Malikian. Dear followers. And those who are present, I would like to thank for to Sinan Artsakh, International Comparative Law Chairperson, representative of the Armenian prisoners of war at the European Court of Human Rights. It's not only about those who are in Baku prisons, but it is also an issue important for their relatives and all of us. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. I would like to congratulate all the journalists and wish all of us resilience and courage to keep up with professional dignity and independence. I believe the lawyers and human rights activists are better protected in authoritarian states than in democratic states. So there is censorship. Many of the issues are concealed and hidden under the context of democracy. And when we talk about hypocrisy under the current geopolitical circumstances, many issues are left behind because the journalists and human rights activists are working in vain because they make the situation uncomfortable for many, and therefore journalists who are dealing with those issues as well as human rights activists will need even higher level of protection. We have to state that the rights of Armenians are being violated in foreign countries as well, however. We wouldn't talk about this unless those are motivated by the ethnic origin of Armenians or their citizenship. At this point in Azerbaijan, we have prisoners against whose rights for liberty and whose human rights are being violated because they are citizens of Armenia or somewhat related to the state of Armenia or somehow are representing the Armenian nation. And hostage politics is becoming a leverage which is being used against this group specifically and in the interstate relations by keeping these people as hostages. Some additional leverages are being used in order to satisfy political claims. If we look at the number of people and the circumstances, there are people who are kept there since 2020, and the statement of November 9, 2020 had to regulate the issue. There were responsible parties. The issues were clearly targeted, but this commitment was also breached, and we have people who are kept there since 2023, when in the period that follows, some documents have been initialed stating peace, but even under those conditions, we do not have any changes, and humanitarian issues such as the release of prisoners as well as clarifying the fate of missing persons are still remain unaddressed. We are not considering joint actions that could have provided swift solutions to those issues. The right of return for the POWs is well regulated, and non-fulfillment is considered to be a crime of war, but this is not fulfilled and implemented, but artificially some legal grounds are being created to justify their discretionary imprisonment, and there have been some actions taken in 2026. February we had 2 judgments, Ruben Vartanyan and the trial of 15, and at this point there are judgments related to the military and political leaders of Artsakh, and the days for disclosing those judgments were not chosen by accident. It was done just before the days of Khojalu, and they had tried to connect that to so-called Khojalu genocide. They have presented this as a gift to their society to remember about those events. There are judgments, and according to Azeri press, they're in force. However, they're not provided to the indictment. It's a sham trial, and even the authorities of this country do not provide the judgments to the addressees. There are no mechanisms that will guarantee the exercise of a simple human right. We have had some successes in this small technical issue with the involvement of the European Court of Human Rights. because we had informed the court that the judgments are not provided, which hinders the exercise of the rights to appeal. And Azerbaijan has made a motion to lift all the protection measures for Armenians adopted by the court, but the court made a judgment stating that all the immediate and direct threats to life and integrity of Armenian prisoners in Baku are still in place. Therefore, those protective measures cannot be lifted, and the deadline has been extended until August 2026. It was important for us that the court directly required the Azeri side to provide to the court all the judgments, and this is how we can get access to the judgments born as a result of those sham trials, to learn about the content and more effectively refute all those arguments and challenge the judgments.
The 19 Armenians are completely isolated, unprotected. In 25, we learned that ICRC stopped operating. At the moment, ICRC is not conducting regular visits. One ad hoc visit had been agreed upon at the end of December 25, right around Christmas. But it was a one-time visit. It's not regular, it's not frequent. Efforts were also needed, even for these one-off visits, to be sustained. Of course, they cannot be done too frequently, but at least one or two visits a year could be critical. The Armenians, I should say also, are not benefiting from visits by their family members. This issue was recently raised during a phone call with Ruben Vartanyan. It was raised by Ruben Vartanyan. There are family members that, in spite of the threats and the security problems, are ready to travel to Baku and to see their family members in closed institutions. But in the context of Armenian-Azerbaijani relationships, this cannot be organized without state-level dialogue and guarantees. State authorities need to engage, help with the visas and the border crossing. And without state support, family members on their own cannot physically be in Baku. This was also publicly raised. We still don't have a positive solution. We're drawing a parallel with the visit by civil society representatives, showcasing it as a positive example where state-level dialogue can ensure mutual visits. We think this model should also be engaged for exercising the family's right to visit. There's no reaction, but the work is underway. It's very important for us to see the reaction of the government of Armenia. The other problem then is the limitation of visits by independent lawyers. Any foreign lawyer has not been able to date, by any means, to discuss the case with the hostages kept in Baku. They were also deprived of the possibility to visit. But in the modern world where you can have remote connection, even that has not been allowed as a means of communicating with independent lawyers. And the greatest challenge, the greatest problem we think we should continue to raise is that the Republic of Armenia has basically left its citizens alone in a closed institution of a foreign state, a state where there's Armenophobia, a state-level policy of discrimination by failing to exercise the right of consular visits. This is not a framework for negotiations, for deals. Rather, it's a guaranteed right for the Republic of Armenia to visit its citizens, and as part of the visit, to provide consular support. So, for instance, if during these visits it transpires that the foreign state violates the right to have a lawyer, or the foreign state fails to provide the judgment, thereby breaching the right to file an appeal, or there are injuries, an independent medical examination is not possible, the staff that conduct a consular visit via diplomatic channels can raise this issue and achieve solution. To date, the Republic of Armenia is de facto refusing to visit the hostages kept in Baku, in a reality where they're deprived of independent oversight mechanisms, and there's no international neutral organization to provide that sort of humanitarian support to the Armenian hostages. Initially, some were supposing that this right cannot be exercised because not all Armenians there are citizens of the Republic of Armenia in a classical sense, and they would differentiate between citizenship in the unrecognized Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh and citizenship of the Republic of Armenia. But on the level of facts, while for some individuals we could be saying this, and there could be contested legal issues, there are cases when the prisoners were just citizens of Armenia, permanently resided in Armenia, were never citizens of the Republic of Artsakh, like Ludwig Mukasyan, who is right now in Azerbaijan, who is our client, is a citizen of only the Republic of Armenia. There's no doubt that he isn't a citizen of Artsakh Republic, so the Republic of Armenia is entitled to visit him. So with these discussions, they've been attempting to justify the failure to exercise this right on the part of the Republic of Armenia, but it is manipulative. Be there real will and desire, there are citizens of only the Republic of Armenia, and their visitation cannot be contested by the government of Azerbaijan. This is a right that belongs to the Republic of Armenia, and this right can be exercised by only the Republic of Armenia through sovereign decisions, and this right can be exercised directly or indirectly, such as in the absence of diplomatic relationships. The Republic of Armenia can exercise this right indirectly through the consular services of other states accredited in Baku. Myself and my colleagues have presented to professional colleagues the international experience. In situations of conflict, other countries managed to ensure this right via other neutral countries. Such could be Switzerland, Scandinavian countries. We officially contacted them. We got a positive reply. They said they are ready to undertake to conduct these visits, provided that the Republic of Armenia exercises her sovereign right. To date, we are not seeing this right exercised, and as citizens of Armenia, we have no explanation why the Republic of Armenia wouldn't want to visit its citizens who are in an extremely vulnerable state. So between the citizens and the state, what legitimate reasons that they could invoke for failing to do so without taxing your time. I'll just point out that the government, understandably, is not going to engage in any international process with regard to the judgments of February 2026. Any process that could delegitimize or neutralize the Azerbaijani trials, which do have legal and political consequences. But the good thing is the families are ready to bear this burden, this responsibility, and although in Baku there are vulnerable relatives, family members, they're going to follow up on legal avenues. Thank you. Thank you very much, Ms. Sagan. Orphaned topics, she said. This is a very painful language. We have not only orphaned topics, orphaned sectors, and really, we're now, when the human rights defenders are rejoicing that it's at least possible to see the texts of these judgments. The government of Armenia is not exercising its powers or its rights to be able to reach out through consular services of other countries. It's called lack of political will. I now want to introduce Mr. Robert Amsterdam, lawyer, international human rights defender, who for several years now has joined and is representing the interests of the church in different places and the real situation of human rights in Armenia, the political persecutions, and then he's covering other topics. Mr. Amsterdam, thank you. Please take the floor.
Thank you very much. The last time I addressed an audience of journalists was in Moscow in 2004 at the invitation of Anna Politkovskaya. A year later, I was arrested. 2 years later, Anna was murdered. So I hope this invitation in no way brings bad luck to the people of Armenia. I want to say a few things off the top. I'm a Jew. And every year we have Passover. And in the Haggadah, the holy book you read about when Jews were enslaved in Egypt, it always uses the word we. We were slaves in Egypt. Those words are what got me into human rights, because I realized as long as an individual is enslaved, they are not them, they are us. And what I say to all of you, shame on Armenia. Shame on Armenia for this behavior in respect to the hostages in Baku. Why aren't you all wearing pictures of these poor individuals? And when Mr. Macron comes in from the airport, why isn't he seeing thousands of Armenians with pictures of these poor hostages? Because while they are hostages, you are hostages. It is very clear that the government of Armenia is being run out of Baku. How much do you have to see in order to know it? Why are you not addressing it in a big and public way? I represent one of the leaders of the opposition who can't leave his home. And his crime was defending a 1,700-year-old church. Now, for 3 years, I have defended the Ukrainian Orthodox Church against an authoritarian leader, Mr. Zelensky, who's coming here. And I'm going to tell you this, after 3 years of fighting, 3 years of denouncing the beating of priests, the stealing of churches, the Ukrainian government has changed. They have announced that they are recognizing the church as being fundamental to Ukraine and not to Russia. This is a gigantic change, and it happens because people were mobilized. There is no excuse for these hostages to be in Baku one more day. Not while you were all living and breathing. Israel had some hostages. You couldn't go into a store without their picture. You couldn't discuss anything without discussing the victims. I come to Armenia, I don't see a picture of these people. Now, there's a lot I can say about human rights, but human rights are about humans. And these people in Baku, these people represent you. For as long as they're in jail, you're in jail. You can't express yourself. You can't have a government that's looking after your interests. Because this government is not looking after your interests. They are jailing the opposition. They are destroying the church. They are pretending that they are independent when we all know they are not. And yet you sit here and you host the EU, which is very nice. Speaking, I know, for my client, we embrace the EU and EU principles. Somebody please tell me where the EU is. That's what I want to know, who these people are pretending they're the EU. Because the EU signed a solemn treaty with Armenia that said above all else is rule of law. Really? What have you done to assist Armenia with respect to rule of law? What have you done with respect to freedom of speech? And let me tell you, this is a binding agreement. And we have the rights in court to attack the EU for their failure to live up to their conditional agreement with Armenia with respect to human rights. And we do nothing but cover this. And this is all, let's be very clear, this is a campaign stop. The EU did it in Moldova. They did it, they're doing it all over the place. They use the idea of the Russian threat, and I won't deny it's a threat, but there's also an Azeri threat. But the biggest threat to freedom in Armenia is in Armenia. How do you not say to these people, speak to Pashinyan? He is distorting the election already by putting people in jail. We have a special task force of the EU here that are actually going to change the social media algorithms to screw the opposition under the basis of some hybrid group operating under a 28-page set of instructions that nobody's allowed to see. They are operating against Armenian democracy, and we are hailing this as a festival of democracy. Armenia cannot sit quietly. Their people have been ethnically cleansed. Their leaders are hostages. The EU is failing to obey its own principles. And there are no pictures of these hostages. Where are they? We are not just lawyers, we are human beings. There are families who have missed their parents. Why aren't those families parading around the streets so that when these EU dignitaries come in, they have to pass the pictures of the hostages? These are the things that human rights activists do all over the world. I'm banned in 8 countries. I can tell you how we've been fighting in all these countries. Armenia must get off its back and take steps that make it clear that allowing these hostages to continue to be in inhumane conditions. And I applaud the attack on the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, where you're going after the individual who clearly was not independent. We just won a big case before the same tribunal on behalf of Tanzania, We won another case in respect to Uganda. We're getting Uganda and Tanzania thrown out of the Commonwealth. There are many things that can be done beyond going to court that involve human rights and freedom of religion. Your most basic tenets of life are being attacked. The Catholicos is not just an individual. He is a representative of your history, your language, and your culture. Every attack on him is an attack on you, and you stay silent. It is unacceptable. This is not how you defend human rights. We don't rely on Cyranoushe or a few other lawyers. We get in the streets peacefully and within the law, and we march, and we take pictures, and we show world leaders that we're not going to sit by when our brothers and sisters are hostages in other countries. This is not how political change occurs. An election is going to take place here in 1 month. In what world is this event that's happening in Yerevan not political interference? In what world is this not against every rule of law? In what world do we not say, well, they did it in Moldova with the same gap. Maybe they've got a program to try to turn elections. They have sent Pashinyan millions and millions of dollars to distort the algorithm. They work only with the incumbents. There's no transparency. The situation is shocking. And we want the EU to embrace Armenia, but we want the EU first to embrace their own principles, like rule of law. I'll be giving a press conference tomorrow on a new white paper we've published that's very extensive on how the EU has breached rule of law with respect to the present rodeo. I want to thank you for allowing me to speak. I'm going to shut up now because I'm too exercised, but I got too aggravated listening to what poor Cyranoushe and her clients have had to go through, and it's enough. There are so many horrible stories in Armenia relating to Artsakh, relating to these people in detention, because the detention is an extended humiliation of the people of Armenia to push them into submission to accept the unacceptable. That's what this is all about. This is not an isolated situation. This is to push people to accept the unacceptable, to give up their history, to give up their church, and do it quietly. And I say no. Thank you very much.
Շնորհակալ եմ
That's why I said with this conference, as we speak about the disgraceful situation of democracy and freedoms in Armenia, we're indirectly defending the European values from the hypocrisy of the Europe bureaucracy. I want to give the floor to Adam Abrahamian, Editor-in-Chief of Arabat Daily, publicist. Mr. Abrahamian, please. Thank you. Allow me also to congratulate us on International Press Freedom Day. I congratulate everyone. With those words, all genre, all directions, all political beliefs, whatever those may be, my colleagues, this is your day, and we all serve one purpose. Press freedom, freedom of expression, democracy. The disgraceful state of these was mentioned. I think it will be covered more today. Mind that most people here are journalists, lawyers, human rights defenders. I think there's a reason. In today's Armenia, these two groups are at the forefront of defending democracy. But I want to speak about, not so much about the press, as hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. In the sense that it is used in the gospel phrase. What is hypocrisy? When you know very well what is happening, you see very well what is happening, but you make assertions that 180 degrees contradict that reality, knowing that reality very well, and you're still pounding your chest that you're value-based, that you follow certain values, but you have no values and you have no base. That, I think, is hypocrisy. Tomorrow the EU's representatives will come and they will glorify Pashinyan for being such, for having established such wonderful democracy in Armenia, and that's hypocrisy. Okay. Charles Montesquieu, the founder of the theory of division of powers, will hear his compatriots come here and praise a government where the judiciary, the executive, and the legislature decide who should be doing what with the Armenian Apostolic Church, or who should be dismissed, who should not be dismissed among the priests. Disordained. They will be defending the government where, on the basis of a Facebook post of the Prime Minister, criminal cases get initiated. Friedrich von Hayek emphasized the importance of local government. His compatriots will come here to praise a government where, when the opposition wins the local government elections, the government, quote unquote, cancels the result of the local government election and initiates criminal prosecution of those individuals, basically depriving them of the possibility to engage in politics and to lead these local governments. Obviously, democracy has many definitions, but one of them is that it is a procedure. Democracy is a procedure via which free competition shall be safeguarded. Free competition for people's votes. That's the most basic, the most minimal requirement of democracy, which is articulated by Joseph Schumpeter. His compatriots will be coming to Armenia to praise the government which changes the electoral code 2 months before the election, which is holding in prisons the main opposition party and alliance representatives. And the representatives say, oh, poor Pashinyan, the Kremlin and the Russians will swallow him, let us defend Pashinyan, and let us thus defend democracy. That hypocrisy is always the neighbor of conspiracy. They hold hands, if you will, as they walk on. I say this is hypocrisy. I say this is a lie. Because Putin's main ally, you could say student in Armenia, is Pashinyan. Both of them turn elections into a farce. Both of them have created a rough authoritarian regime. In one case, the EU representatives see it. In another case, they fail to see it. Both of them are trying to marginalize all types of adversaries. Some of them are declared foreign agents, and others are declared spies of the Kremlin, spies of the Russians, agents of the Russians, and slaves to the Russians. These are the same regimes, but one is supposedly defending itself against the other. Colleagues will be citing dozens of facts, but I've highlighted a few. Under these circumstances, the work of the press is obviously very challenging. The persecutions that also exist here against the heads of media here, Artsakh and 168 hours. I think these persecutions also will be covered by my colleagues. But if you were to ask me, what really irritates me the most, when any journalist asks an inconvenient question to the representatives of the government, they do not answer. They start, at best, reading a lecture on what free journalists should be like and what their questions should be like. So they undertake to lecture. At worst, they attack and they swear. So I want to repeat this slogan: Stop Hypocrisy, stand for democracy. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Abrahamian. I hope that you will be heard by the guests who are in Armenia, who are here not only with their delegations, but representatives of their special services and their media.
By the way, all the diplomatic representations have been invited. Of course, not the ambassador or deputy ambassador, but at least to send the representatives, and their absence shows the way they treat us. Armenia Ohanyan, editor-in-chief and founder of Artsakh Daily. Before Ms. Ohanyan comes here, I would like to say that Mr. Abrahamian mentioned two media outlets that have been politically persecuted, but it is about all, actually, all those media outlets which have opposition views, which disagree with the politics of this government and raise sharp questions. As far as I understand, I am invited here as the editor-in-chief of the most persecuted media outlet, but I won't speak about specific example of Artsakh as a media outlet, but about media situation for the last 8 years. Let me start that never in Armenia we had greenhouse conditions for the journalists. No authority liked journalists. Moreover, depending on their level of morality, we have been persecuted and oppressed, and the level depended on the way they treated us. So we have gone through water, through trumpets, and through fire. But nevertheless, we were able to win some freedom lines. And we're not going to retreat, we're not going to concede here. So we will definitely resist, and the resistance shows that we are fighting for our rights. So I would like to do a kind of analysis of what happened in our lives after 2018. Many of the journalists have had close relations with previously opposition representative and editor-in-chief Nikol Pashinyan. We were hoping that the working conditions will become much more convenient than before 2018, that the work would be respected, some favorable conditions for our work would be established, we won't face previous pressure and prosecution, because now we have a person in power who knows the life of journalists, difficulties we go through, both editors and journalists, and also this person should have respect for freedom of expression, freedom of speech, because of the freedom of expression he came to power by exercising this right to freely express views. He was fiercely criticizing previous governments. He wrote thousands of articles, and more than 10 years he was editor-in-chief of the most opposition media outlet. And we hope that he understands that media outlets in all countries and in all times have the same function. They have oversight over the government, over the authorities, in order to actually stop corruption in the country, to have public monitoring and hold the authorities accountable. We were wrong. Schwartz masterpiece, that those who kill the dragon take his place, become dragons themselves. We had similar transformation, degradation, deformation, you call it, you name it. After days they were in power, they started to prosecute, to intoxicate, to defamate the work of, also limit the work of media outlets, also defamate and target individual journalists. I can give you thousands of examples how this was manifested and how difficult it was for journalists to work during these years. Just a couple of examples. In 2018, in June, July, a campaign against Hypocrisy was launched on Facebook. The campaign was led by Lily Minasyan, if I'm not mistaken, who is now an MP, member of the parliament, and recently she was proposing in the parliament to adopt a law if media outlets publish anything after the official explanations, sanctions should be applied against those media outlets. And Suren Papikyan, Minister of Defense, said, yes, let's work on the draft law. I won't be surprised if they have absolute majority and able to adopt any law. Why they shouldn't do that in this case? This was the first Facebook campaign against Hypocrisy in July, August 2018. Afterwards, many limitations, restrictions, shameful situations, starting with physical abuse of journalists entering into their private space and life, taking over the physical premises of the we have seen everything during these years. In 1920, they have changed the law on gambling, and it was prohibited that media outlets publish any commercials about gambling. And it was a serious hit because 40 or 50% of our advertisement income was coming from betting companies. And we were telling them that it's not going to limit the turnover of the gambling industry. People will continue to play. There is Facebook, there are foreign media outlets. You cannot fully restrict advertisement. Compared to 2018, we have multiplied turnover of the gambling businesses. Then there was a process or wave of taking over the physical premises. Puzant 3/1 was under the municipality, and another building which was managed by the Department for Property Management were taken over, and the last point was the media building that was taken over. So in the Soviet times, where there was no free media, even the Soviet authorities have appreciated the work of media and created some conditions for those outlets to work freely, free of charge, pro bono, or paying very little rent. In our democratic country, our quote-unquote democratic authorities decided that there is no need to do that, and they carried out this process. Then Parliament, restricting the freedom of movement of media representatives in the Parliament building. This was an innovation from these authorities, that the journalists cannot enter specific spaces or take interviews in specific areas. We have had cases when we were told, you're asking wrong question to the public official, you have asked that question in the wrong place, you should not ask it here. So these people are so detached from reality, and they hate free speech so much that they forgot about the mission of media. Journalists at any place can ask any question if it is in the public interest, and they even can breach the law if it is also in the public interest. You can enter the private space and even go over some lines if it is about satisfying public interest and serving public interests. I believe it's in all countries of the world. Another form of oppression are the court claims. Satik spoke about number of claims against media outlets. In case of Haraparak, it is quite unusual because the Prime Minister personally went to the court with a claim of 1 million AMD compensation for non-pecuniary damage. The court showed that the material part was rejected by the court, and they have only granted one sentence refutation by the media outlet. There is no judge in Armenia who would rule against the Prime Minister. Nevertheless, we have appealed that judgment. I am very calm when I get those judgments. I think it's normal. It is normal around the world. People can go to the court. Of course, it takes resources and time from us when we respond to those claims, but mostly we win the court cases, and we're able to prove that we had the right to make such a publication. However, the most serious and systemic campaign against the media was on social media, where the representatives of these authorities feel like fish in the water. They know how they can exploit various Telegram channels, Facebook, Instagram, and other social media to silence media outlets. Many fake campaigns and attacks have been organized against us. All our publications are followed by curses, by negative comments. It's like a parade that we always see. They know well how they can report to Facebook administration, YouTube administration, against all media outlets. And we have had cases when media outlets had lost their pages with many followers, and this entails also some financial losses. And there is something that they do quite regularly. It's fact-checking. Many individuals or organizations are trying to apply sanctions and limit our followers and audience under the umbrella of fact-checking. we have had cases when our authors or interviewees faced organized campaigns and attacks. So a person who has won in an international competition wrote a good book, and we had a positive publication, then calls us back and says, please remove that post from your site because under that post we have inhumane campaign. You can't call them human beings because they can write whatever you imagine or cannot imagine. Curses, and it is only because this person has opposition views or criticizes a behavior, statement, declaration by the incumbent government. For example, may say something positive about Artsakh. So he is immediately defamated, cursed, and this is the attitude of this government, which permanently speaks about the hate speech. And here where you see the Phariseeism of the incumbent government. They go to international fora and claim that they have been targeted by hate speech. These poor civil contract members of the parliament are suffering because of the hate speech when they are the forefathers of this hate speech themselves. And one more point to add. This government has pig killers. Those are not the ordinary people who write comments. Those are, again, those represent the elite of this government, about 10 to 20 people, not many. However, they are like obedient troops. They receive an order or command and they start writing stata against some people, against specific editor-in-chief or opposition leader or media outlets. And it is clear that they're working as a team, as a choir, and quite efficiently because people are being offended, insulted by these words. We have immunity, of course, that we have developed during these years. It doesn't bother me at all. But this group of killers or assassins, Vahagen Alexanyan, Ruben Rubinyan, Alain Simonyan, Hayk Konjugan, Arthur Havanisyan, they have this well-trained group. They know how to go live, how to write status, how to insult people. This is my favorite topic, and I talk about this everywhere. Ruben Rubinyan is a very interesting guy. He is using his vocabulary, brilliant vocabulary, against the first president, who is 8 years old, also about editors-in-chief and media outlets. For example, about me, you cannot say that I am not well brought up or well educated, but he has done that against me as well. So if they do not like the media outlets and they don't like the question raised, they're immediately responding, who is funding you? So we have published our financial statements for the last years in order to satisfy his curiosity, but he was not satisfied. I have invited him to our office to provide all the documents because we have the list of our clients for advertisements on our website, published and open. And he may say that several contract parties funding us because the largest advertisement is from several contracts, or we have been financed by this government. This year I have signed that contract, I gave them the highest price, they agreed to that. So you can say, Ruben Rubinyan, you are funding Hraparak daily. So in conclusion, would like to say that regardless of all this phenomena, their modus operandi and the steps they take, and despite the fact whether they will succeed on June 7 and will be re-elected, they should know press was, is, and will be independent regardless of their old aspirations and desires. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Sohanyan. But we invited you definitely not as an oppressed media outlet. It's hard to oppress you, but also over the course of these years, as they say, the more they hit us, the higher we started to fly. I want to give the floor to political scientist, constitutional expert Vartan Povosyan. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation for this event. When I was coming here, I didn't know the title of this. And I'm pleasantly surprised that the topic that I want to present and the topic of this event are fully aligned. My topic is the June 22 anti-constitutional change in the position of the European organizations. And the second part of my topic, the position of the European organizations, is directly the same as the hypocrisy, the racism which exists in the European organizations, in the field of law, among others. Unfortunately, also in the European Court of Human Rights. Let me start with a question. If in any democratic European country one vote were to fully disregard the Constitution and change the composition of the Constitutional Court of that country, the Constitutional Court guarantees the Constitution in any democratic country where there is the rule of law overnight, without referendum, without professional discussion, without any sort of oversight. The answer is clear. There can no longer be a constitutional court. There can no longer be constitutional order. There can no longer be the rule of law. There will only be one authority called the Constitutional Court, but really turned into an instrument of the government. A document called the Constitution, but that Constitution can no longer defend the citizens. It can no longer defend them from or the statehood. But that's exactly what happened in 2020 on June 22 in Armenia. On that day, the blow to Armenia's constitutional order was so heavy that we still suffer the consequences, and the country has not recovered from it. Now, let me give you the chronology, which is very telling. June 19, 2020, Friday, 7 p.m. After office hours, draft amendments to the Constitution are taken to the Parliament. Weekends are off, of course. Monday, June 22, 1 p.m. An extraordinary sitting of the Parliament is called. And for just 65 hours, the draft is put to a vote. The result of the vote: 3 of the 9 judges of the Constitutional Court immediately lose their positions as judges of the Constitutional Court. The powers of 4 others are cut short. The mandate of the President of the Court is terminated immediately. And that's done by 1 vote of the ruling majority. And now I would like to discuss this on 3 levels. The first level the level of violations of the Constitution. The second, and the main one, the position of the international organizations. And the third, in theory and in practice, what should be done in this situation. The violations of the Constitution that occurred on June 22 are diverse, more than 10 violations. But I'll just speak about 3 of them, and I'll speak very briefly. The first violation, bypassing Chapter 7 of the Constitution. The Constitution is very clear. Article 164, paragraph 9 provides that the cases in which it is possible for the powers of a judge of the Constitutional Court to be terminated, there are only 4 grounds in the Constitution for doing so: violating the requirements of incompatibility, such as losing citizenship of Armenia, engaging in politics, violating thus the requirement of political neutrality, health reasons, making it impossible to continue serving in office, or committing a significant disciplinary offense. Exhaustive list of 4 grounds is contained in the Constitution. Mind that Chapter 7 of the Constitution may only be amended by referendum. The Parliament cannot just decide to terminate the powers of a judge of the Constitutional Court. But the government did not discuss Chapter 7 at all. Article 164 was bypassed, and the government chose an avenue which for any lawyer would be truly surprising, shocking, not in how competent these people are when they propose this change, but surprising only in terms of their ingenuity. What did the government do here? They decided to change one of the transitional provisions of the Constitution that was long ago implemented, completed, and exhausted. Article 213 of the Constitution that was amended on that day, before that amendment, provided a very clear solution for when the newly amended Constitution was to enter into force. Back in 2015, the amended Constitution provided that in the future, when the powers of the judges of the court will be 12 years and not until age of retirement, 65 or 70. Article 213 provided that all those judges that were elected before the amendments to the Constitution will continue to serve until the end of their term under the Constitution. All those elected later as judges of the Constitutional Court would continue to serve for 12 years. So that provision had entered into force. The Constitution had been amended in 2015. And those amendments had taken effect in 2018. And then all of a sudden, bright legal scholars from civil contract on June 22, 2020 decided that it's okay to go back to a legal provision that has exhausted itself and to amend it. And with that, they dismantled the Constitutional Court. The third and most obvious violation was that our Constitution very clearly provides that any amendment to the Constitution before it is adopted, and it is adopted either by referendum or by the National Assembly, must undergo ex ante constitutional control. So the Parliament must go to the Constitutional Court requesting to determine whether the proposed change is consistent with the requirements of the Constitution, and it's a binding requirement. Article 168 of the Constitution concerns ex ante constitutional review, and Article 169 is much clearer in defining that obligation. It says that the Parliament must apply to the Constitutional Court if it wishes to amend the Constitutional Civil Contract. Ruling majority simply said, well, as this concerns the judges whose powers we want to terminate, it makes no sense to go to the Constitutional Court because they would not be impartial, so we don't apply to the Constitutional Court. One vote deciding that Armenia's constitutional order would be overthrown. Why constitutional order? Because without a lawful and constitutionally defined procedure, their country will not have a court lawfully elected, so nobody can defend the Constitution. And in that country, the Constitutional Court becomes a paper court in someone's pocket. And then after June 22, 2020, we saw clearly we no longer have a Constitutional Court. We have a court that is rubber stamping the decisions of the executive. So the most obvious point was the disgraceful decision of the Constitutional Court that really cancelled the Declaration of Independence of Armenia by saying that it is no longer a part of the constitutional order, that it has nothing to do with today's constitutional order. I will not turn to all the procedural violations that were committed by the majority in the parliament in violation of the bylaws of the parliament, but there is a funny point I want to briefly cover. Before June 22, 2020, the procedure was that the act regarding changes to the Constitution would be published by the President of the country. On that same day when they amended the Constitution, they also amended the bylaws. They took away from the President that power, they gave it to the Speaker of the National Assembly. And so the Speaker of the National Assembly published the so-called constitutional amendments. Let me turn to the main point now. After all, the Venice Commission, being opposed to these amendments, did something fatal to Armenia's constitutional order. At the time, I was a member of the Venice Commission. Since 2019, I was fighting hard to get a critical assessment of everything that Armenia's government is doing towards the judiciary. At first towards the ordinary courts and then towards the Constitutional Court. But unfortunately, the Venice Commission decided instead to state in its opinion that in principle, the aspiration for this change in Armenia's executive is legitimate, even though in 2015 there had been a constitution to define the procedures for electing and dismissing the judges of the Constitutional Court. Understanding that I'm dealing now with an authority that, even though it's called the Commission for Democracy Through Law, in July 2020 I stepped down from that commission. In 2020, Ms. Hypocrisy is no longer here. She was representing the application of all 4 judges to the European Court, 3 of whom were immediately removed from office, also the office of the President of the Constitutional Court. The European Court demonstrated a bright example of hypocrisy. At first, it refused to engage in the so-called urgent procedure. Secondly, it completely refused the application for additional measures, claiming this had not in any way undermine the independence or the tenure of the judges. It admitted the case, but then after 3 years, it suddenly decided that that case is really not going to be heard by the European Court. The European Court took 3.5 years to hold that case, and then finally said the application by the judges cannot be acceptable on procedural grounds. On procedural grounds, that application got refused. The European Court completely disregarded its own jurisprudence in the case of Hungary, where there had been a similar situation when the Hungarian government adopted a law and dismissed the president of the Supreme Court. And the 2022 Poland case, where there was a similar situation, and they had very clearly stated and found that the dismissal decision directly contradicted the fundamental principles of law. At the end, I want to say, if we are trying in our country to achieve the rule of law and justice, we cannot turn a blind eye to this unlawfulness. And so all the unlawful decisions that have been taken over these years, in particular after the 2020 unconstitutional amendment to the Constitution, all of this merits a legal assessment. How exactly it can be done, only lawfully, but regarding the questions that concern the methods of termination, they must be discussed comprehensively, and of course it can only happen if the forces that win in this country truly value and cherish democracy and the rule of law. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Professor, for being so principled. Although I know, and I won't say any names, although we did publish the name in the press, there were individuals who you might think had a strong constitutional background, but they provided ill service to this government, and they wrote the text of the justifications for the Venice Commission. So this government isn't saying anything about them with regard to corruption or whenever they speak about the old government. Mr. Orbelian, since I'm trying to respect this principle, to get another editor to speak next, and I'll ask and invite Mr. Kalistian, founder of 24 News and editor-in-chief, political scientist. But in the meantime, I want to address you, the lawyers, the human rights defenders, the public figures, once again, and thank you, because, as Mr. Abrahamian said, we have media representatives here and lawyers, and they are at the forefront. Whether it's rain or shine, snow or ice, or if Macron comes and the streets are blocked, you're still doing your work. Thank you for that. Mr. Kalistian, go ahead, please. Thank you very much, dear colleagues. Congratulations on Press Freedom Day, of course. For Press Freedom Day, we're celebrating this day in rather symbolic conditions, with the logic that there are enormous challenges, and it's a terrifying atmosphere for the activities of the media. I want to start with the following. After all, the media are not a stand-alone entity. They're not separate from society, and in 2018 and 2020 in particular, with the onset of the challenges for our country, for our state, the media, whether they like it or not, they became those fighting the reality that was imposed on us. My colleagues have spoken about this, and the lawyers here have spoken about this. They were also at the forefront. I want to first discuss why that happened. We tend to forget that in 2007, 8, 9, as a result of the processes that took place in Armenia, there was somewhat a crystallization of a part of civil society that were trying or had managed in becoming a counterbalance to the incumbent, somewhat criticizing the current government. And that's important for any society, because without civil society, there would be serious problems in any country, in any society. With that logic, I want to go back to 2008 and what was happening with the formation of civil society. The Western partners, such as the EU, very clearly and directly giving support to civic and political issues. In 2008, after the 1st of March, because of political views, people had been arrested, and the question of their arrest was in the center of attention of the EU and the broader West. Remember, there was kind grandpa Thomas Hammerberg, Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe, who would come to Armenia once every week or 2 weeks, regularly visited the prisons, they negotiated with the Armenian government. I was also talking about through civil society in Armenia. So let's admit that it produced some results. Many people had this Hammerberg package that set them free after the 2008 events. I'll talk about what we currently have from Europe. But the 2018 events struck a heavy blow to civil society as well, because the vast majority of their representatives became government. Those who didn't become government, officially, de jure, became de facto government, so they became annexes to the current government. With the absence of that buffer, or the so-called civil society that was meant to become that buffer, meant to be the front runner for human rights and so on, with the absence of that buffer, automatically the media had to play the lead role. They de facto also play the role of civil society today. So in that sense, they're also most directly attacked by the current government. My colleagues, Mr. Abraham and Ms. Sohanyan, also spoke about financial attempts, how the media are being closed down. So I got TV, for instance, but it was an example of this war and fight against the Armenian Apostolic Church, resulting in the decision to take away Shoah from the public multiplex. On top of everything that was happening with state media, how they were taken out of state buildings, their leases were terminated. This wasn't as being done by a government, the vast majority of the representatives of which were journalists in the past. So these circumstances, the media became really a thorn in the eyes of the government. In the absence or distortion of civil society in Armenia, or the vast majority having become a part of the government, the opposition, which was supposed to perform a function, unfortunately was unable to play any balancing roles of the media, again, came to the forefront. In addition to all those attacks on the media by the government, I think the worst thing which is happening is delegitimizing the role of the mass media. In other words, the Armenian government is making sure consistently in Armenian society, among the people, that it creates an atmosphere where journalists and media stop being a tool through which people find out the news or get the analysis or get alternative opinions. And how is this being done? As Mr. Hoynan spoke about the so-called army of killers that are on a daily basis targeting the media. Besides alternative sources of propaganda, which this government knows very well, the different Telegram channels, Facebook platforms, and dubious speakers, some of them are not even in the Republic of Armenia. Moreover, some of them are actually in an enemy environment for the Republic of Armenia, and that their statements, their messages about the media become the legitimate narratives for the pro-governmental media. With these conditions, the classical media or the journalists or the websites are delegitimized. And that's really one of the most important instruments of the incumbent. All of this is happening with daily hate speech against the media, targeting the heads of the media, targeting the journalists, targeting their family members, spreading dirty news about these people, private life and so on. This is daily practice. We're seeing this with a lack of balance in the public and political systems. Therefore, the media have largely become, willingly or inadvertently, the main alternative to government, or in a way, the main opponents or creators of alternative opinions. And this obviously goes on, and there's the faulty practice of attacking the resources of journalists. In 1 minute, we lost our Facebook page that had been developed for about 4 or 5 years, and we couldn't recover it, and then the next one was attacked. But I think 24 was not the only one. I know the same happened with 168 and with Hraparak, and those attempts continued. The so-called, what do you call them? The rapid response group or hybrid warfare group, which was 99% invented by the incumbent, will be used as a stick against the media. I'm sure these campaigns will continue. To your colleagues, all of us together need to make sure that we're ready to be attacked in YouTube and in Facebook and all our platforms. All of this obviously will undermine democracy and the freedom of expression. Such are the attempts of the incumbent. One more thing which is related to this symbolic thing that the EU's, the European political community's event will be happening in Yerevan tomorrow. And obviously, Nikol Pashinyan will be congratulated for being the champion of democracy in Armenia, and Civil Contract will be congratulated for being the champion of democracy in Armenia. I'm sure that as that happens, we'll be seeing lots of limitations of the freedom of expression, limitations of the freedom of media. We'll be seeing lots of limitations. Double standards are nothing new for world politics and world history, but it's very disgusting when you feel it firsthand. We, as Armenian media, felt it from the West and from the EU, and we continue to feel it. Starting in the 2000s, the press was never really in a greenhouse. There were violations, there was persecution of the press also by the previous government. We had tens of cases. But at that time, those media enjoyed some protection because the organization with that stamp of democracy, the collective West, was paying attention to these problems. So these organizations were not alone. Today, with any problem affecting the media in Armenia, this is their own problem, their own limited problem, and a problem for their media colleagues only. So we'll continue to see these double standards, and unfortunately, whether we like it or not, we have to do this on our own, relying on ourselves. So Armenian media are perhaps the most Armenia-centric organizations, because we don't need, no, we do need, but we will not receive the support of any foreign actors. And the final point here about the change of quality of the media as attempted by the government. I don't even want to use the word medium, but the pages, the organizations, the websites that are generated by the incumbent, the so-called one or two journalists that simply hold a microphone in their hands, but they're disseminating hate speech. Remember a horrifying case about the Artsakhis when they were directly disseminating hate speech. The public was irritated, and they even had to pull it out. This changes the quality of the media in the eyes of the public. When people see and they say, if this is okay, then everyone is the same. We will surely have a problem here. And it's also true that in the future, when it is possible for the media in Armenia to make some changes and opt in some self-regulation is needed. It's necessary because the sense of responsibility needs to grow continuously. Ms. Iranian, we need to stay focused on these issues and try to draw a line. Thank you.
I don't know what should Ms. Iranian do under those conditions, but about international law, what should I do with these mushroom sites? But because at this inappropriate time, I would like to thank Ruben Bajanotovek and who have supported all of us during these years. So they were acting like an ambulance when we were approaching them, and because of them we were able to recover our pages. I would like to turn forward now to Mr. Aram Orbelian, Concerned Dialogue, Managing Partner, International Law Specialist, and Lawyer. Mr. Orbelian, you have so many cases in different genres, illicit property, violating freedom of speech, prosecuting journalists. I give you this heavy task now. Thank you for organizing this event and inviting us. I would like to congratulate you all on the day of International Day of Media. I was thinking, what shall I talk about? So, on the one hand, it should be about freedom or freedoms. I thought about the guarantees for the property rights, but then I decided to talk about constitutionality. So, and differences between perceptions and realities. So in the Republic of Armenia, unfortunately, We have had 3 constitutions plus 1 small constitutional amendment with serious consequences. But the question is how the Constitution is perceived, not by citizens only, but also by specialists. We see that there are some differences, and whatever is perceived and whatever is in reality are often distorted, and we're not able to overcome the syndrome of the king, because everything is built around the king, whatever model we take, whatever text we write, whether it's Soviet model with the councils or presidential or parliamentary, semi-parliamentary model. Nevertheless, we actually build everything around the king, the person of the king. Why am I raising this issue? Because there were several legal processes in Armenia. One was about the constitution regulation of releasing the Joint Chief of Staffs. The other one was related to removing from the office the President of the Constitutional Court, then interference with the private companies. And everyone has this perception. The Prime Minister should be able to do that because he is ruling the country. He has to be able to do that. But in reality, the highest body, the highest legitimate body is not the government or the Prime Minister. The highest legitimate body is the Parliament, and then several institutions have higher legitimacy than the government. For example, judges who are appointed by the Parliament. It's about the judges of the Constitutional Court and the Court of Cassation. Prosecutor General, who is appointed by the 3/5 of the votes. Some of the independent self-governing bodies appointed by 2/3 of the votes. So we have an impression that the government should be able. How is it possible that they are not able to do that? As a result, we have wrong perceptions, wrong understanding, and we're saying that the Constitution is bad because it's not working. So we can change the Constitution, have completely other thing, and then we will get to the point that how is it possible that an ex-public official is not able to do that? We will revert to the current situation. One of the issues is that we have to understand we have adopted the Constitution, and the rights guaranteed in the Constitution, we should protect ourselves. Robert Amsterdam said we have to fight for our rights. And I have said this many times, there would be no system where a person who killed a dragon would not try to become one. This is possible if the fight is permanent, constant, and not this intensive. If we get back to normal, there would be some mitigation of this intensity. So then, as the freedom of media or press in Armenia is guaranteed, it's not about fragmented interventions. I would like to speak about some of these nuances so we understand. Compensation of non-pecuniary damages. So pecuniary damage could be compensated materially. This is in place in the legislation for a long time. And there is so we have 3 and 6 million for the insult. Those are the maximum caps. So okay, probably they have determined this amount based on some reasons. So the media outlets would be responsible. 1087.2 for torture, for example, in the Republic of Armenia. If a public official would torture an ordinary citizen, the maximum compensation is 3 million. For wiretapping, it's 2 million. If you interfere with the private life, it's 2 million. So if we have published defamation or insulted a person, it's 3 to 6. So if we entered your apartment, breached the privacy rule, we have wiretapped you, we have published some shameful information, we ruined your image and life, it's only 2 or 3 million. It shows predisposition against specific phenomena. So it could be 10 years of imprisonment or 3 or 6 years for specific crimes, and we would say that the state gives more freedom for those who could be sanctioned to 10 years. And this is now being discussed in the scope of the draft authored by Alan Simonia. If we go back to the constitutionality, we read constitutionality and we say that constitution should work by itself. It's not about resistance. No, but some articles of the Constitution are being neglected. Not that we don't want to go into the depth of those articles, but because of lack of knowledge or attention or interest. We have Article 75 about the human rights, and it says the main rights and freedoms, procedures, and regulation. So when regulating fundamental freedoms and rights, the law should provide necessary procedures and regulations to fully exercise those rights. So there is a good joke. Who is this? This is John that no one can catch. Why? Because no one needs him to catch. So if you try to feed disinformation, Facebook algorithms, obviously false publications from the government or manipulative statements, and there is no need then to oppress further. And if we add here also financial component, if we take out the financial component, there is no issue with oppressing media outlets, because this becomes meaningless. Whatever you write, it will be simply dissolved in a big flow of information. So we make some references to the Armenian legislation or to the European legislation, for example, German legislation. So because it's the Press Freedom Day in the German constitutional law, there are values. Press, printed. Press is protected and is financed. So in various countries we have various procedures, but most of them are usually self-regulated. It's financing done through the self-regulated body from the government budget. What is happening in the Republic of Armenia? The most recent initiative is there was a foundation established to provide funding only to those TV channels which are represented on the public multiplex to create publicly beneficial content for the public. We have Article 42 of the Constitution which guarantees freedom of media. Why do we need freedom of media? Because this is procedural guarantee for freedom of expression. Everyone has the right to form an opinion, express opinion without interference from the local authorities or public authorities, and search, receive and disseminate information. This is basic right. We all have right to search for information, also analyze this information and disseminate this information or ideas, whether the government likes or dislikes them. And you cannot label them as terrorism, anti-state activity or anti-government activity. I simply disseminate information about specific facts. It could be the Mount Ararat or status of Artsakh or the right to return or any crimes against humanity in Azerbaijan or any other issue. It should not be related to a very specific event or a global nature. And there is a second point. media, TV, radio, and other media outlets are guaranteed their freedom in order to receive and disseminate information. So when we take the President said it is media, so go and work. No one is going to interfere. This is not going to work. Misohanyan, for example, spoke about the fact that advertisement is being shut down for the gambling sector. So it could be another advertisements banned, then other restrictions introduced. Then we may say the service should be kept here, or printed media should be regulated differently. So when we actually insert this all into financial model, we see that the freedom is not guaranteed. The last one was told to Mr. Abraman that we're not going to extend your rental agreement in the building. So we're saying that the church should be taxed. Okay, church is an ordinary organization, it's legitimate. It doesn't sound well, but let's do it. So we open European countries' constitutions. In European countries, the church is not only free, tax exempt, but also the government collects taxes from the citizens and transfers part of that to the church. In France, it is somewhat limited. That's the only exemption. In all other countries, there is a tax that you pay from your income tax, which goes to the church. You may choose the church, but it should be one of the main confessions. So you cannot say that it should go to this denomination, which I established yesterday. So donations are tax deducted in many countries. If I would be a citizen of any of those countries and I will decide to donate something to the church, I will get it back from my taxes paid. So there will be a tax rebate, and it will be deducted next year. So this is the global standard because it supports the activities of the church, and is also because the spiritual life of the person is very important. Therefore, it should be safeguarded. Okay, we go further. Interference with private companies and their activities. I should change the Catholicos. It is illegal by its nature. But if I would like to change the executive director of the INA, and it was done, now we have a temporary manager. Same was done with the Football Federation of Armenia. And we see that abnormal becomes normal or becomes normalized. So when we finish this, some people will call me and will tell me, why do you say this? Why shouldn't I? Because there could be some pressure on you. But I haven't done anything illegal. Many are the cases, and we have had them in our practice, when a person comes and they shoot a penalty for tax violations, and then I hear in response, but we do not engage in politics. But politics and economic activity are not linked. Subconsciously, standing for your rights and being held liable are on the same footing. So why he went there and said that? Because of that, they have appropriated his property and they should have done it. So in this context, it is important to understand what has been normalized in our subconsciousness, from the Overton window to any other term is being used. But when we are being deprived of our property, it's not normal. If non-partisan or apolitical institutions become political, it's not acceptable. So if you open the website of the Prosecutor's General Office, 70% of the news, if not more, is related to the property issues. It is important, but a small part of the protection of public interest by the General Prosecutor's Office. So, for example, there is a claim against the nephew of the niece of this person X to confiscate X amount. As a result, this part of the square in the city was returned to the public. It's not about why they have done it or why they have not done it. If it's part of their functions, they should do. If not, then they should refrain from that. But it shows how much the prosecutor's office is politicized, because the current agenda of incumbent government is only about assets and property. The situation with drugs, with violence, crimes with trafficking is not important. It's only about the statement of penny by penny. So you open and you see that. And there are some countries where prosecutor's office is political. This is also acceptable, but the model is different. So we should not say then that we have apolitical with higher legitimacy. Prosecutor General who says, Mr. Prime Minister. So the Prosecutor General who has higher legitimacy, which will require the appointment, the votes of more parliamentarians than the Prime Minister in voting, should deal with the corruption issues, and not only of the previous government or previous officials, but incumbent ones as well. Nara Galstian was saying that the West came here. The West came here actually to close down the issue of March 1st, and it was closed, which means that at the level of any relations on the streets based on the respect, family, or in political life, if the issue is closed, it should not be reopened. So apply amnesty, change the law, do not have retroactive application, and then the same person comes to the same topic and starts to hold people responsible from the other angle or from the other prospect. So you can name it the way you want, but hypocrisy would be if they would say go, and then they would start another process, another example of being politicized. A person in the parliament says that I don't think that there are so many bastards in Armenia that will actually vote for the opposition. And the same government said that all public officials should have integrity. So we present a report that it doesn't fit actually this definition. Start a procedure and sanction this person. Anti-corruption commission becomes fully politicized to the last cell, and I'm saying that I am a citizen and I will definitely vote for one of these three powers, one of the three. And I have been called a dog. And anti-corruption commission is not launching any procedure. And what is the explanation provided in the decision? There is big text. Nothing is changed. Nothing is out of context. They take the entire text and then says, makes a statement related to the representatives of the other political parties, one of them, who used exactly the same expression. So you have actually a clear violation of the presumption of innocence. To what extent it is related to the reality, because the investigation is in process, and they add to that the agenda of the incumbent government and calls it tri-headed or triple-headed movement. and says that if they win, there will be a war. We don't know whether there would be more concessions or whether those have been already agreed, and that's why, if he's not elected, there will be a war. Then we go back to our situation. As a citizen, I'm going to vote for one of the three. So let's assume that we have bypassed the presumption of innocence. They have offended me, but it doesn't mean that you can do that either. For us, it is important that we all go back to business. Some of the institutions should go back to their functions, and let's not rely on the Americans or Europeans to change something in the country. There are external players, they're not going to disappear. One will go, the other one will become more active, the others will become more passive. Those are external factors, but our issue, our task is not to let those external factors to interfere with our internal affairs. We talk about hybrid wars, but we're in a situation of hybrid street fight. Whoever wants tries to interfere, and this was permitted by the incumbent authorities. So at some point we have to go back to the better perception of the constitutionality and use our constitutional tools. We should apply ourselves and require other institutions to apply them by actively working with them. Non-application or non-use of these tools will lead to the final collapse of the institutions, and this will lead to war. Everyone fights with everyone, and they will say that this is also a threat. This was done by Hobbes. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I won't talk about that hybrid enemy animal. Mr. Bertanation will speak about that animal. I'll remind you, Bakasakyan's 2 terms of elections in Artsakh 2007-2012. I remember very clearly the number of international media that had been invited, the observer organizations had been invited. We were covering it, the assessments they made, what a democratic election they called it. Remember that vocabulary? All of a sudden that got all forgotten. And now, an unrecognized state at best. I want to give the floor to Artsakh human rights defender Keram Stepanyan. Thank you, dear colleagues. I also want to start off by thanking you for the invitation to participate and extend my sincere gratitude to all the representatives of Armenian media, especially those that continue until now to raise the topics of Artsakh and the Artsakis, because for that, at times, being targeted by hate speech or being targeted by the individuals and the fakes and other actors that serve the incumbent. The slogan today is vote the voice of Armenia, and I think that voice of Armenia should also include the voice of the displaced Artsakis currently living in Armenia. When I was thinking about what to emphasize, I decided it will not be a standard speech about the social, economic rights or other rights of the Artsakis, but rather to try to use this opportunity and to use the fact that this conference is also being streamed live with English interpretation to deliver a message to the international audience, to those who will be in Armenia and will be following this conference, have been or will be or are following international media or politicians. What I want to say is this. In my speech today, I want to speak about the so-called peace process, the position of the Artsakhis, or what do we really feel about everything that has gone on or is going on, and to link it with human rights or the freedom of speech. In a way, this may seem emotional to many of you, but it's better for me to say what I feel rather than to avoid and to say superficial texts in order to not leave the impression of being emotional. On the so-called peace process, what is our perception of 150,000 Artsakhis? What is the first thing we feel when it comes up? First of all, of course, betrayed. Betrayed, not just betrayed as a people who wanted to live in their homeland, but betrayed in terms of human rights, democracy, and the universal values. And I'm sure that in the building of sports and music's complex, this will often be the topic. They will be praising the peace, not a peace based upon justice and universal values, but based on ethnic cleansing and genocide, and destruction of the cultural legacy, and really nothing else. But this is only one side. When we go a step further, this is not all that is presented to us. We're told to forget what happened, forget where you're coming from, what life you had, and do not dare speak or cherish hope of return. Do not speak about the right of return, because with that you're undermining Her Majesty peace. The peace that I repeat these days will be praised and glorified at the summit of the European political community and the subsequent other events. And then when you try to disagree, there will be accusations. There are accusations. It goes further. They say, you know what? Those 30 years you lived in Artsakh, that wasn't happy life. You were a political hostage. You just didn't understand it. So that the happy life, the proud, dignified life you had was actually hostage-taking. And you should be happy that as you lost your homeland, you gained freedom, and you should live and enjoy that freedom. Do not dare think about return or talk about return, because you're getting in the way of Her Majesty peace. So, when you talk about this, they will disagree and say, with this, you're endangering security of Mother Armenia. And then, as a human, you start thinking, but I don't want to undermine security of Mother Armenia. And with these manipulations, in a way, they drive you, or they try to drive you silent. Turning to the next point, how else does this peace process look? Desecrated churches or tombs, abandoned homes, destroyed property. And you have no right to speak about our spiritual legacy being destroyed, because with that, you're again getting in the way of peace. They say you should not talk about it. On the contrary, you should, on the level of the incumbent, they're justifying it. The destruction of the main temple in Stepanakert, with the fake analogy, with Artsakh. How can this be characterized? This is not hypocrisy. It's the next thing after hypocrisy. Then you say, but my rights should be defended in international courts. They say, no, the initialed document says that all these claims should be withdrawn. There shall be no claims. And so you should not talk about it, because if you do, you're getting in the way of Her Majesty peace. When you're speaking about social rights of the Artsakhis, their social rights in Armenia, you're saying, you organize a demonstration common claims, they say the Karabakh clan is raising its head. And you know, the international law, does the country have the first safe haven for a refugee or displaced person? So that first safe country is definitely not about social or other security. It's about mental security. Refugees should be not targeted. In Armenia today, the people who are the most targeted are the Artsakhis. Also among the media. Anything about Artsakh is targeted. The topic of return is targeted. They say, oh, you ran away, you should have stayed and you should have fought. We kept you there for 30 years. Artsakh was a burden. We barely dropped it. These manipulative claims that are not just the consequences of a bad experience of an individual. It's a top-down policy. And the case in the metro came to illustrate where it's coming from, who's at the top of the hate pyramid, how it's being fed, and for what purpose this is all being done. And I want to repeat, these days, during these summits, there will certainly be talk of peace, this peaceless peace. I want to take this opportunity to ask the participating European officials, which one of you would like your country to have this type of peace? When you answer that question for yourselves, then the hypocrisy will be revealed. I'm sure that with this unjust peace, nobody would ever fight so hard or glorify it or feel so enthusiastic. In one meeting I was told, so what do you want now? To always defend your version of justice or to live in happiness? I don't know what are the perceptions of happiness of that person who said it, but I'm sure that people who with common sense cannot be happy in an atmosphere of injustice with the constantly continuing unjust situations. And in conclusion, I'm not here to complain. Or just to simply make statements. I'm here to say that this atmosphere is not going to erase our memory or silence us or kill our right of return. On the contrary, this injustice will always drive us to fight for justice. One day, finally, that justice will perhaps come. And that's when we can speak about Her Majesty peace, but it will be genuine peace. I think this is the voice of the Artsakhis that should have been heard today at this forum. The voices that are currently present in Armenia. Thank you.
Mr. Stepanian, you spoke about painful issues, and we are the eyewitnesses of that. Artsakh is our brilliant Artsakh, was the giver of our security, our defense. We have lost Artsakh. And by losing Artsakh, the government has opened the doors and windows for the war, for the people of Armenia. Hovannes Khudoyan, human rights activist and lawyer. So he will talk about this strange animal called hybrid war, and not only about that. Thank you, Ms. Iranian. We had discussed and agreed that I will talk about two topics today. Attacks on the Armenian Apostolic Church, and of course, because of the symbolism of the day, oppressions against media outlets. So the topics are so big that each subtopic could be valid for 2 or more hours of discussion. But I will talk about this toolkit of oppression and draw some parallels, how and to what extent the attacks on the media outlets and church are similar. So before starting, I would like to once again congratulate you, my dear colleagues, representatives of media. You are doing very challenging job, and be well, but be careful as well. Because at this point, I will use a term that you haven't heard, of course. It's hybrid war against you. So there is a proverb: the thief shouts the loudest, catch the thief. And they use this expression, hybrid war, everywhere in all possible scenarios. So we'll go into the depth of this term. It is no different than war, which is millennia old, and it's always hybrid. So use of various tools, various methods to defeat the enemy. It's a set of actions that you deploy to achieve that goal. So if you take out the word hybrid from the hybrid war, nothing has changed. There is a war launched against you. So drawing a parallel, the same war is unfolding against the Armenian church. If you look at the toolkits, these are not different. That someone says something bad about a journalist or a clergyman, or someone abused, let's say, a journalist or a clergy. These are tools which are complementing each other, and I will say a couple of words what tactics are being deployed against the church and journalists. The mildest one is reducing financial resources, limiting the resources, which is and was done throughout millennia. You have to attack the reserves of the enemy, you cut the communications, you deprive them of water and food in order to make them weaker and then defend them.
մարմինների կողմից։ Հաջորդ լեվելում, հաջորդ հարթությունում ատելության խոսքի գեներացումն է։ Սա թերևս այս պատերազմի, հիբրիդային պատերազմի ամենակեղտոտ ու ամենավտանգավոր հատվածն է, որովհետև այստեղ ներկա են, ավագ սերնդի լրագրողներ, ում առաջ բնականաբար չեմ կարող ասել, որ նախկինում լրագրողները երբևէ խնդիր չեն ունեցել, բնականաբար եղել են խնդիրներ, բայց եթե դա կարող էր լինել անձնավորված կամ ինչ-որ առանձին հետապնդումների տեսքով, ապա այս դեպքում լրագրողների համար պրոբլեմների ստեղծումը մասսայական բնույթ է կրում այն իմաստով, որ այդ ատելության խոսքի գեներացիան տարածվում ամբողջ հասարակության մեջ։ Պատահական չի, որ գուցե նոր աշխատանքի ընդունված անհայտ որևէ լրագրող, ով կյանքում որևէ վատ բան չի արել, առաջի անգամ միկրոֆոնը վերցրել է դուրս եկել հարցեր տալու մարդկանց, հանդիպում այդ ատելության խոսքի, որ դուք լրագրողները այս երկիրը քանդեցիք, սուտ եք տարածում, կեղծիք եք տարածում եւ այլն։ Ինչ։ Հա։ Սա իր ակունքում չունի մարդկանց, օրինակ, չգիտեմ, թերի կրթությունը կամ ինչ-որ սեփական դատողություններ անելու հնարավորությունների բացակայությունը։ Սա իր ակունքում ունի հստակ ատելության խոսքի գեներացիան, որը առաջին հերթին կատարվում է, չգիտեմ, գործընկերը համարում եք թե ոչ, ձեր նախկին գործընկերը վարչապետի կողմից, որպես լրագրող, իր քաղաքական թիմի կողմից եւ իրենց կողմից հովանավորվող էլի ձեր գործընկեր կոչվող անձանց կողմից։ Այս պարագայում նաև ուզում եմ կոնկրետ հանգամանքի անդրադարձ կատարել, օրինակ երբ որ արգելի պարոն Աբրահամյանը փաստարկված ներկայացնում է Հայաստանում բռնապետություն կառուցելու եւ դրա դրսեւորումների մասին, ձեր գործընկեր համարվող Պետրոս Ղազարյանը իրան թույլ է տալիս շատ գռեհիկ ոճով արձագանքել իր Facebook-յան էջում եւ այդ ատելության թիրախավորումը շարունակել եւ թույլ տալ նաեւ դրա ներքո տարբեր տեսակի fake եւ ոչ fake օգտատերերի կողմից ինչ-որ ատելության կամ վիրավորանքի խոսքերի գեներացիան։ Անդրադառնալով եկեղեցուն, էլի տեսնում ենք, որ այս ատելության խոսքը բարբերաբար գեներացվում է տարբեր հարթություններում, տարբեր թեմաների հետ կապված, էլի 18 թվականից սկսած էլի կաթողիկոսին թիրախավորելով եւ օրինակ հիմա շատ հաճախ այս քննարկումը կա, որ եկեղեցու դեմ այս արշավանքը ուժ է ստացել 23 թվականից հետո, երբ որ եկեղեցին սկսեց ավելի ակտիվ զբաղվել Արցախյան հարցի բարձրաձայնումով, բայց իրականում եթե տեսնում եք, օրինակ 20 թվականի մարտին Ալեն Սիմոնյանը, չգիտեմ առաջի անգամ թե չէ, բայց առնվազն արձանագրված է, որ կաթողիկոսին էլի դիմում էր իր աշխարհի կանոնով, էլի հեգնական տոնով, դրանից առաջ 19 թվականին վարչապետն էր էլի հեգնում եկեղեցուն եւ որոշակի սպառնալիքներ հնչեցնում քողարկված, որ եթե ժողովուրդը որոշի, որ մենք պետք է միջամտենք եկեղեցու գործերին գործերին մենք կմիջամտենք, եւ այս 24-25 թվականներին հատկապես ակտիվ սկսեց զարգանալ եւ աճել եկեղեցական պրոգրեսիվ հենց եկեղեցու նկատմամբ ատելության խոսքը։ Թվում էր, թե սա այնպիսի միջոցառումների համախումբ է, որ ինքնին բավարար կարող էր լինել զանգվածային լրատվամիջոցներին եւ եկեղեցուն չսիրող խմբի գործողությունների համար, բայց դրան նաեւ որպես արդեն իմ մասնագիտական խորը դժգոհություն արտահայտեմ, նաեւ այս արշավին միանում են Հայաստանի Հանրապետության իրավապահ մարմինները եւ դատարանները, որտեղ օրինակ կարող են լրատվամիջոցների դեմ ուղղված տարբեր տեսակի հայցերով, դատական ակտերով փորձել ճնշել եւ լրացնել, նույն ժամանակ եկեղեցու դեմ դատական վարույթներով կարող է հայտնվի դատավոր, որ որոշի, որ ինքը կաթողիկոսի գործառույթ պետք է կատարի եւ arczepiskopos նշանակի կամ հանի իր դիրքից։ Ամփոփելու եթե լինենք, սրանք սպառիչ գործիքակազմերը չեն, բայց այս յուրաքանչյուր ուղղություն եւ գործիքը գալիս
each tool complements the other. So for example, when the hate speech is disseminated, it will definitely lead to the violence against journalists in some specific cases, and lack of response by the law enforcement will further encourage those who generate hate speech to become more intensive. And if we compared with the situation that we had 2 or 3 years ago, and the level of hate speech against the media outlets in case of such campaigning, it's much higher now, despite the fact that the tools have not changed. The effectiveness has increased. This is probably the conclusion of my today's speech, but I would be the bad guy of today's event, and I will also say a couple of words about the facts that were raised in some of the speech. Mr. Ohanyan said that there is kind of issue about funding of the media outlets, whether the sources were independent or not. I can accept the fact that Ms. Ohanyan and Raparak has won the battle, but we're losing the hybrid war, because this is my personal view, and I'm not an expert and dictate my will, but disseminating propaganda of the ruling party will lead to the situation where war against you will become more effective, and it's not about specific facts of the same propaganda in other outlets. The situation may have no way out, but under these financial constraints and oppression, limiting resources, they are forced to do that. But I will ask an open question without expecting an answer. What is the difference between the incumbent power giving a contract for advertisement in the media outlet to advertise the attributes of war, for example, disseminates insulting information about the Catholicos and give money to disseminate this propaganda, or to get some money because of the clicks or likes, when the same information is published by the media outlet, probably in a different format, also with a critic, but in some way they also disseminate the same hate speech or hate narrative in this case. So, a few words about Mr. Amsterdam. Mr. Amsterdam's speech, he said that in the Republic of Armenia there are no people with the posters who should be in thousands. And he actually criticized the Republic of Armenia. Mr. Amsterdam was in Armenia for 1 year, and we have to be grateful and thank him for active participation against all those manipulations. But in Armenia, there have been demonstrations with these pictures, and people went on the streets in hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, have been abused, beaten, tortured, prosecuted, subjected to political persecution by the government, supported by the European and Western powers. And I don't think that victim blaming is correct in this case, because the Republic of Armenia, people of Armenia are not guilty that they are at the focal point of geopolitical interest, where the entire threat of this hybrid toolkit is being applied. Therefore, retrospectively, many of the events and actions could have been more effective, but when you have existential war threat and you live in this region, political adventures are well thought of, and the historical time given for that is much longer. And as of today's actions, we have to strengthen our fight. We have to represent all interests, and this should be done by those people who have those organizational skills and capacities.
Thank you. Mr. Abrahamian, you might remember we've been around for quite some time, and from time to time we remind editors, ex-editors like Nikol Pashinyan and Petros Khazarian. Mr. Abrahamyan probably remembers we had countless meetings, discussions behind closed doors with former leaders, presidents, prime ministers, and others. Petros Khazarian was like a chicken with his mouth closed. He wouldn't even dare disagree. There were lots of people there, and they would agree, they would confirm. Even in closed meetings, he was afraid to talk. So that's what we should remember. I don't know where his stones are being thrown. They're not even hitting. They can't even reach the target. Finally, I want to present Karen Vertanesyan, propaganda researcher expert. But it's true that Mr. Vertanesyan came a bit late for good reason, but that's not why he's speaking last. Well, you were in the list before that, but the reason why you go last, Mr. Vertanesyan will be presenting something very important as the final presentation. Armenia's deterioration in international rankings and reports. And there can be speeches in the sports and music complex today, and they can talk. But even with the data, they've used these numbers, but democracy has deteriorated according to different reports. Mr. Vertanesyan, please. Bastion of democracy or deterioration of democracy. What are the stories they're telling us? The international organizations, what are they saying about the democracy of Armenia, which has been advertised so much? Let's start with the most important thing, this bastion of democracy. How did this language even reach us? As I was preparing, Facebook somehow read my mind and showed me this wheel. Tararat Mirzoyan saying that he's the author of that term. I'm sorry, he was beating around the bush. He said he didn't mean that Armenia is a fortress of democracy or a democratic country, but a battlefield where there is a fight for democracy. But bastion is actually a fortress or an element of a fortress. This is a bastion, it's a special type of fortress. Hexagon is what a bastion floor plan would look like. But anyway, this was in 2019 during the Congress of the Civil Conduct. What he said back then was not that the US and Europe, but Armenia is the bastion of freedom and democracy in the world. But in that speech, he said something else. A much more important thing, which nobody noticed back then. He said, they're waging a war. He didn't say against who. He avoided saying it. But I remember, I say this often to the opposition politicians, you continue to remain in the pre-2018 political normalcy when your opponent is not an opponent, is not a political opponent, but it's an adversary that is waging a war against you. So that war terminology, if you've noticed, is really in abundance among them. Before the hybrid war for 2018, with the first light criticism beginning with broad euphoria, they started saying that there's an information war against them. So their whole logic is really one of war. There's one more unrelated comment. That peaceful, non-violent, velvet, love and solidarity, all that beautiful packaging of the non-violent struggle which brought them to power was in reality a military toolkit too, in the sense that people don't die, but it is accomplishing military tasks, and their logic is completely military. The example of how the non-violent methods could be used in war situations is the siege of Artsakh. Everyone knew these were fake activists, everyone knew this was fabricated, but it wasn't violent, quote-unquote. From the very first days when they came to power, they tried in all ways, the incumbent Nikol Pashinyan, to show that they're agents of democracy. He would say, democracy is in my genes, it's in our genes, things like that. This is 2018, the summer, a quote from one of his interviews. Democracy for us is not a foreign policy orientation. We believe that democracy is our principle, it's our belief, it's our creed. After a short while, this was during the campaign of Ike Maruchan mayor pre-election campaign, September 2018. They now often say, here, a new dictator is being born in Armenia. I was one of the people who said that, by the way. Back then, it was obvious this was moving towards a dictatorship. And yeah, they mean me, you. Folks, I know that in the Republic of Armenia, we can never again have dictators. Meaning, we're not saints, but if we want to do something bad, people will quickly take care of us. He was using that logic very well, but then let's understand how they understand democracy, how they define democracy whenever they use that term. Recently, relatively recently, last summer, a journalist asked, democracy, what about the checks and balances? How about that? You know what he answers? He says, the first challenge of democracy is to defend democracy. And many countries, he says, are in a situation now where with these checks and balances, they've made democracy too vulnerable. Nor they're thinking of how to defend democracy. So the most important, the most fundamental mechanism of democracy, independent and free elections, free and fair elections, and the other one is checks and balances, for the government to be kept in check between the different branches of power. And he considers that this is some sort of a harmful thing. And he even says it's a threat to democracy. the main tool of democracy is a threat for democracy. What that means is he sees himself as the democracy, but it's different in different situations. He identifies himself with the people, with the state, with the government. And the Armenian Apostolic Church and the followers of the Apostolic Church every once in a while. And then there are others noticing who he identifies himself with. This has been seen from outside, but anyhow, he is opposed to true democracy, and he speaks about this openly. He even says the vertical of the power cannot be breached. The vertical of power, remember? Very popular language about 10 years ago in a country where they speak Russian, where Russian is the state language. The vertical of power may not be breached, undermines statehood, sovereignty. So we understand that their perceptions of democracy are totally undemocratic. And the other thing, democracy is primarily about the development of democratic institutions. No one challenges that. But democracy has a cornerstone. People have the de jure and de facto possibility to form government. I mean, this is a simple truth. They present it as that model of democracy, of which it is the cornerstone, saying, well, we were conducting elections, everything else doesn't matter. But what's really happening prior to the elections, or then what's happening after the elections, is not getting discussed. Elections are the only criterion, but look at the indices. In the elections, there are electoral authoritarian countries, where it looks like an election, but it's a decent dictatorship instead. And then, this is a great speech, and then in the sense that all the arguments are contained here. The whole world, the advanced humanity, considers us to be democratic, no doubt. By the way, this speech, in other circumstances, had someone analyze this for 4 hours, and then this is the 4th hour of his interview when he says it. I'm sure by that time nobody was listening. I mean, I just randomly found out he did say that democracy is a threat to democracy, he said. This could have resonated a lot outside of Armenia too, but it didn't. Instead, his videos with Zamfira's songs are going viral around the world. Anyhow, it's a very interesting thing. A new type of dictators, autocrats. One of their features is they appear as Democrats. It's just cheaper, less outside pressure from the West. That way, it's easier that way to rob in your country and to enjoy it in Europe or North America. So people have understood a long time ago that by building concentration camps or mass oppression, it's not really, good to enjoy. You don't have to send these kids to the UK for education, and that's very costly. It's not good if you have blood on your hands. So instead, they played this democracy game. That whole story was very nicely articulated by Sergei Kulier and Daniel Treisman, the co-authors of this book, which is called Spin Dictators. Spin Dictators. It says that the key novelty of new autocrats is that they're screaming about them being democratic. I have an extensive collection of Nicole saying how democratic he is. What is the real opinion of the democratic community? So ask the democratic community this. That they say, I've seen Now I've reviewed a number of international ranking tables held in high regard. Perhaps the most fundamental one is Vidam Institute's Democracy Report, which I think started back in 2014. The other one is the well-known Economist's Research Selection Democracy Index. The third one, Bertelsmann Foundation Transformation Index, which is used by the American Congress in its calculations. The Freedom House, you've all heard about the Freedom House. But there's a less popular one, rating, which we'll see at some meter. It's just for countries of the Eastern Partnership, those 6 countries, including Armenia, which are within the Eastern Partnership, and Journalists Without Borders, the Press Freedom Index, where we've been heroic as Armenia. So what is Vidam? Vidam is really not just one parameter. It's a compilation of parameters. I don't want to go deep into the methodology, but it's called Liberal Democracy, and we also have the Electoral Index and others. So they collect all that and they come up with something like this. Armenia is moving towards authoritarianism as an electoral democracy. Towards electoral democracy are not a compliment. In other words, it means it's an incomplete democracy where elections supposedly work, but in reality, many democratic institutions don't work, so it's an incomplete democracy. But most importantly, they say that it's moving towards autocracy, so it's getting incrementally worse. Well, in reality, the sharp improvement of Armenia as a democracy was due to the euphoria of 2018. I profoundly believe this isn't as correct. They gave some credit, rather. Back then, I personally felt a lot of the pressures. I can say confidently this is exaggerated. Though we understand another thing here, these indices really have some inertia. Things happen, they will not show up immediately. A lot of things get weighed, and then it gets reflected in their numbers. But for the time being, Armenia is sharply deteriorating, making it in the world's top 10 of countries that are becoming authoritarian, or turn out to autocratizers. So we're in the top 10, according to the Vidam Institute. This is The Economist. This is the general picture. They say the whole world knows us as democratic. It's not true. Armenia is not even a flawed democracy here. An incomplete democracy, but it's presented here as a hybrid regime between a flawed democracy and an obvious dictatorship. Something in between. The other one then, Bertelsmann Foundation, the European thing, but it's an international organization, it's in different places. And here, if you see Armenia, it's called the defective democracy. The defective democracy here. By the way, this is interesting. This one index is really favorable to the Armenian government, very soft assessments in many areas. But with their 2026 report saying that Pashinyan's rhetoric has significantly transformed He used to be the traditional political leader, but increasingly more now he acts as a moral or religious leader, sometimes comparing himself to God or Jesus. The critics and the media accuse him of this, fortifying these quasi-religious narratives and using state resources for doing so, trying also to limit the Armenian Apostolic Church's influence by political institutional means. Those ratings, even if there isn't a lot of pressure, they see very well what is happening. The obvious cases, at least. Freedom House, a well-known organization, again, considers Armenia a partially free country, a flawed democracy, if you will, or slightly above a hybrid flawed democracy. Definitely not a bastion of democracy. It's really deteriorated in the Press Freedom Index of Journalists Without Borders. Very highly regarded organization. Armenia here slided back from 34 to 50th. That's 17 positions. There are positions or items where it's gotten worse. From 33 to 57 in terms of the political freedoms rating. In terms of legal protection of journalists, it slided back from 14 to 45. It looks worse under certain components. In terms of freedom of press, Armenia is a situation in a problematic country. It's a CSO meter, very delicate. But the general trend is deteriorating. It's in yellow, you can see the downwards trend. The trend was downwards also after they received the report of the Armenian Center for Political Rights on the biometric audiovisual recording law, and we softly moved to the 1984 dystopian reality where in Yerevan it would be impossible to find a place in the city center that wouldn't be under a police CCTV camera. The problem of ranking tables, they have institutional inertia, so they react quite slow. It takes a year or two for some things to get reflected there in the tables. There's obvious bias towards Nikol Pashinyan. This is felt for whatever reasons. Different reasons here. From how the geopolitical factors influence the situation, all the way to who is their source of information in Armenia, who they cooperate with. And often they cooperate with organizations that brought Nikol, took part in bringing Nikol to the power, and we're still enjoying the fruits of it and under its platform. For the ruling regime in Armenia, working very aggressively to deafen any criticism. From my experience, and I was interviewed by 6 or 7 media, foreign media, 1 or 2 of the interviews only got published, the others were blocked. I gave commentary and it was published, and after 30 minutes the journalist called me and said we got a call from the Armenian government demanding to remove it, possibly, or the embassy. But it took 30 minutes from the publication to them calling me, or their journalist calling me. And there's a key factor here. Independent society, not getting any money, or if they're getting any money, the hybrid financing, civil society not screaming loud enough, an opposition to our political opposition not raising a lot of the problems before the foreign platforms. Often they heroically prefer to suffer silently, grinding their teeth, but only the government benefits from this. So how to withstand? Firstly, very shortly, what is the sliding back of democracy? The campaign by the government for weakening the pro-democratic political institutions or their destruction, which is exactly what Nikol Pashinyan said. The checks and balances, getting in the way, undermining democracy, this is exactly what it is about. A different approach is needed to withstand the backsliding of democracy than to undermine an established dictatorial regime. When the opposition replicates Nikol Pashinyan's methods to try to remove him, they don't work. According to Vidam statistics, 80% of that slide back ended up in becoming a dictatorship. It's hard to pull back. There are very few cases where it's possible to stop or reverse that backsliding, even if the dictator is removed from power because all the mechanisms have fallen apart. Whoever comes next becomes the dictator, which is like that dragon story. 5 stages of the backsliding of democracy, presented as successive stages, but we can also go in parallel. Many people stop trusting democracy. The people like Nikol Pashinyan, the populists, the very aggressive ones, all those figures that are opposed to pluralism will start fighting for power. If they manage to win and come to power, then the next stage will be the corrosion of institutions. If you remember, after the 2018 election, the government wasn't formed for 40 days. For 40 days we had no government, remember? And we said, well, it's their incapacity, they're sloppy and so on. But all these pauses really helped the corrosion of the existing system of governance. In other countries, they do it in other ways, they call it something else. Well, also here they said the state institutions, the ministries need to be efficient, they merge them, they break them down, they create new ministries or super ministries, and then a lot of old employees fall out. Professionals, people who know that some things may not be done in violation of law, appointing, acting, interim officials, also contributing to the backsliding of democracy, parallel to dismantling institutions. Next, demolishing the political landscape so that the political actors cannot ever change anything through elections. We've been through this in several cycles. We're in this in number 5 when everything is finished, the final line of defense, civil society. Really the systems that are beyond the state. Public infrastructure, also the church. From this point of view, the church is the kind of infrastructure that can mobilize people and organize resistance. In parallel to all of this also, the media from day one will be undermined. So how to withstand this, and I will conclude. We need to change the paradigm of resistance. This is what I mean, with that style that we will all come together now and do a powerful demonstration and a rally, and for 2 weeks we'll block the streets and we will win. It's not going to work that way. This dictatorial regime is so deeply entrenched now that we need to think about longer-term resistance so that its activities become harder and more costly for this regime. The second thing is creating infrastructure for civil resistance, developing independent media. You might say, but we do have independent media. We have very few independent media that are barely covering the daily news. Very few. The sovereign expert community, experts being called to different places and speaking, and often being ridiculed and criticized for not knowing basic things. To have a decent independent expert community, these people need to somehow have the possibility to not work in other places, to concentrate just on their professional work. And also teams of experts, like think tanks, which we seem not to have in Armenia, that would bridge research, media, and education. Sovereign national civil society. This came up often today. As we know, after 2018, it turned out that the people that appeared as civil society, not all of them, of course, but many of them, or the majority of them, were just diplomatic agents of foreign powers. The other important thing that we need for resistance is a democracy agenda. None of the opposition forces consider democracy to be their primary line. They make a lot of promises. They try to be more populist than equal, which I think is simply impossible. To speak about rights or the protection of rights, regardless of whether they get elected, whether they win or they don't get into the parliament. It's very important for people to believe what they're saying. Building trust in society, between society or civil society. Building trust is no lip service. You need tools, mechanisms to always put them in place, and consolidation and not division. Unfortunately, this division process contributed selflessly by the different camps of the opposition. So in a way, I'm really getting disillusioned by this. Thank you for your attention. Apparently, you're all tired. And one more thing. How this beautiful word peace is abused. have to explain that this is nothing related to peace. There's also peace studies. In lecture 101, there's an explanation that whatever is happening in Armenia is not peace. When you put a gun on somebody's head, say, stay silent, this is not peace. Graveyard silence is not peace. Prison silence is not peace. We're to see if there is no peace. They're just pacifying us until the enemy has a suitable moment to attack again. There's no peace. We need to constantly speak about it, not to say that this is not a good peace, that we want dignifying peace. We have to not say this is not peace, period. Over. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Vertanis, for your presentation. Dear colleagues, I didn't take a coffee break because it was really available and our colleagues are going in and out and being interviewed. This conference is over. We heard things we had heard before, things we agree with, things we disagree with, but in conclusion, I want to express my agreement with Mr. Amsterdam that some action is needed. Algorithms even, the internet and media algorithms require some steps to be taken. And I was just watching by just speeches or interviews or conferences, it would be hard to deliver these messages to our citizens. And I agree that the voice has to by video message, Christian Solidarity International, President and Human Rights Defender Artsakh, President of the Center for International Comparative Law, Human Rights Defender, Representative of Armenian Prisoners in the European Court of Human Rights, Adam Abrahamian, Editor-in-Chief of Araboteli, Robert Amsterdam, lawyer, international human rights defender Vartan Powesan, political scientist, constitutional expert Adam Orbelian, Concerned Dialogue Law Firms, managing partner, specialist in international law, Armenia Ohanyan, founder and editor-in-chief of Raparakteli, Keram Stepanyan, human rights defender of Artsakh, Ruben Merlikian, human rights defender, lawyer, Ryan Karstian, political scientist, 24 News websites founder and editor-in-chief, Awanas Khudayan, lawyer, advocate, Karen Vertanis, and propaganda researcher, expert, and Tekneir Seydanyan, president of the Union of Journalists for 168 Hours, editor-in-chief. Thank you to the interpreters.